So we have a 5-minute rule.
Uh-huh. All right. It's this everybody.
I'm not sure. I think JV.
Yeah.
Also, is Falcon Fireside here?
Yes.
Muted. Okay. Uh,
All right. Well, I guess uh we will get started with out JV. Um,
Or without
all
Fireside.
right. Or oh, all right. Or without maybe Fireside was just setting us up and then we're going. All right. All right. Anyhow, I guess let's get started. All right. Welcome everybody. This is our first Filecoin OG fireside chat. Motivation behind the chat was Will and Rebo were chatting at ETH Berlin in May and had some chance to talk about some of the challenges that are facing Filecoin, and realized that maybe we need to talk about this in like a larger group with more perspective, um, and that could be shared with the community. And so here we are. Um, So part of the reason Phil Plus was heavily discussed is Will Scott is currently the CTO of Fiddle, or Filecoin Incentive Design Labs, which is trying to incentivize good behavior on Filecoin, and right now is focusing a lot on Phil Plus. Reba's been an engineer at Protocol Labs for a number of years, working on Filecoin and large-scale data storage onboarding, and been sort of involved with Filecoin and the storage provider community for a number of years and has context on what's going on there. Um, uh, George was formerly a technical PM at Protocol Labs research for a number of years, and spent a lot of time with Consensus Lab, focused on blockchain scalability research, including for Filecoin. And we have Danny O'Brien, who's been a senior fellow at the Filecoin Foundation for a number of years, as well as a journalist and digital rights activist, and previously director of strategy at the EFF. I'm Adine. I work on IPFS and Liquidity, and have sort of been watching a little more from the outside Filecoin for a number of years. So some context, but less on the deep inner workings of Filecoin and Phil Plus than the rest of the folks we have here. So I guess maybe to start a little background on Phil Plus from a more naive perspective, um, for those who are less involved. So I guess my understanding is that it was started with FIP3 about 4 years ago to basically try and incentivize um, try and incentivize sort of behavior to help Filecoin grow as a storage network. It's something that people would want to use for storage, and basically help smooth over some of the incentives that make working with actual user data more painful than committing capacity as a hardware provider. And that to do that, it's sort of set up as like I've heard people refer to it as like maybe like an ICANN-ish sort of structure, where you have like there are sort of these sort of like roots that are delegating out authority, but then sort of the actual management is maybe a little more um, is a little more like looser than it is necessarily like the concrete, like, A has these keys and B has these keys kind of thing. Um, and that the major like terminology things to be aware of are allocators, who are supposed to be performing due diligence on clients and saying, yep, this seems like someone that should be, it would be good to effectively subsidize, that the Filecoin network would effectively like to subsidize in order to be able to help bring in and work with more client data so that the capabilities of the network for storage will grow. And data cap, which is effectively the thing that the token or the thing that allows you to say, yep, this thing is associated with this specific type of data that has been approved by the allocators. One more thing, I guess, before we dive into the Phil Plus is I see we have JV here, who is the founder of Answer Research and the Filecoin TLDR.io website, which interfaces with Filecoin ecosystem partners, token holders, and the wider community. He's been embedded in the Filecoin ecosystem for several years as a leading biz dev and is one of Filecoin's #1 advocates. You can see him on all the social media platforms doing all the things a lot of the time. All right, so maybe I had maybe my naive take of this, but I wonder for sort of you all what you felt was like the original motivation and goals of Phil Plus. I don't know who wants to take a first stab.
Are you calling people or
I'm not.
people
I
just
know.
talk?
I know. Whoever wants to. There's too many. I don't think we.
All right.
I feel like we're gonna be here for a long time if we round robin this. So whoever's game.
Awesome. I'll go first. So I guess the first thing that I need to say is that the history of Phil Plus that you just kind of recounted is one version of how this was seen, both by the community, by some of the people who are putting FIP3 together, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's great that we have JV here. He can kind of give his view of the entire process because he was very involved in FIP3 back in the day. But to give a little bit more context on what happened. So FIP3 is something that was accepted in August or something like that, maybe even July. The point is that it is something that was there from the start of the network officially. The ability to do data cap, which is effectively another type of currency in terms of like how it actually operates in the network. It is even an actual ERC20 token, which has restrictions on moving it. You can't trade it, but this is literally how it is implemented. And originally we did a bunch of tests and so on and so forth, and it was available from around mid-December of 2020. And really didn't take on until there was a concerted push somewhere towards the end of 21, when more and more folks started using it, and it started skewing the reward distribution to basically the more people use it, the more others need to use it. Otherwise, they would be falling behind in their earnings from the consensus of the network. And this brings us to today, where effectively, and I'm speaking to pretty much all SPs at this point, including like messages that just happened in Filecoin like literally 10 minutes ago. Unless you have access to data cap as a storage provider, you can join the network for economic reasons, not because the network is like permissioned. You can do it, but you're going to lose money if you don't onboard your hardware with data cap attached to it. So I just want to throw this context in there that yes, the idea of Phil Plus was this, what Adin kind of summarized. What it is today for storage providers is basically an additional thing that they need to procure, just like they need to buy Filecoin to be able to start their actor, to be able to do pledge collateral and stuff like that. They need to also procure data cap in order to participate in the network in the first place. So that's in practice where we are today.
I don't disagree with all that. I think maybe to more directly summarize, at least to Adin's original question, like what was the primary intent? I think you can actually find a talk which was me rehashing. Like I actually can't find Juan's original talk on this because he was the first one who gave one. But there is a talk that if you go around like when the network launched that I gave that used his slides on this, which was literally just running through what is like the game theory of like if Filecoin is intended to be a useful storage network, like why and like I think the actual real thing is like there was a lot of things that were not optimized. So if you were purely just doing paid deals, it would have been too expensive to do on the network. I actually don't even know if we're under that number yet. We should talk about that at some point. But like I think the intent of Phil Plus was like Filecoin needs to be a useful storage network in order to be valuable. And so like how do we steer inflation, which is deletion of token holders, towards sort of like the productive thing? I will add my own little 2 cents here, where it's like, I think the rational argument for this is not about like just the pure philosophy of like, hey, we should store arbitrary data sets or whatever. Like ultimately, Filecoin as an ecosystem is only sustainable when people pay for its services, which is like people paying to like store data, people paying to retrieve data, and so on. I think the goal of Phil Plus is to say, look, if we're going to have early bootstrapping incentives, how do we steer those incentives towards the productive activity that can create like recurring value in this economy? I think that's where like the point that Reba is making is like what Phil Plus today does not necessarily mean that Phil Plus is delivering on those initial goals. I think it's like worth asking the question of like, is the system that we have today actually enabling that thing? And are there better ways of doing it? I think there's like a lot of things inside of there. But like the original goal, at least in my view, is like Filecoin is meant to be a useful storage network. The actual end state that we need to get to is people transacting for the services that are happening. If we're going to have these incentives, how do we steer the incentives to support the economy?
Just a very quick hand to add to what JV said. This kind of gets to the heart of why I joined this meeting, and I want to talk about these things. Filecoin, Phil Plus is almost like a symptom of what is the network for, because a useful network has multiple dimensions. And from my perspective, where Phil Plus is effectively the de facto additional currency that kind of splits the network into haves and have-nots, is skewing the network too much towards public data, which in my opinion undermines its original purpose, which is people storing data with providers on the network. And when you look at any kind of market with demand for storage of data, the public storage is a rounding error in that. So that's what I would want us to dive into, if we can. What is Filecoin for, and to see if we can kind of get to at least some agreement or a yes and kind of state. George.
Yeah, I won't address this challenge here, but just to go back to your initial question of what was Phil Plus intent to do or to be, I think, you know, obviously JV and Reba have summarized it rather well. I would say that the very cynical but very short TLDR was an attempt to prevent Filecoin from becoming Chia. And so Chia at the time was getting a lot of bad rep as well, although this wasn't just a PR exercise, but it was getting a lot of bad rep for basically destroying hard drives to provide consensus. And Filecoin wanted to differentiate by actually storing useful data. Useful is a poisoned word, but by storing useful data instead of just speeding hard drives and loading and verifying proofs, right? And so that's where Phil Plus actually comes up to try to create that differentiation.
For what it's worth, at least when I had my initial conversations with Juan, I don't think Chia ever came up. I think actually like the long-term thesis for Filecoin is like basically like the incentive sort of like massive flywheel that like crypto can have to like acquire hardware. But like over the long term, I do think it's like the goal should be to try to like incentivize cash flows in. I think this is where it's like, I added it as a comment, and I don't know if comments are going to show up in this recording. I do think there's like questions that I would be curious if like, how do people, what are people's various theories for sustainability? I think this actually falls into like the Phil Plus conversation of like, who pays for what, and like, how do cash flows come into this economy over the long term? But I think at least the initial theory is like Phil Plus as like sort of like redirecting this frenetic energy into things that like over the long term would be monetizable because it's like useful data. And I think even with some of the computer over data talks that people have given since, people have talked about like, oh, if there's all this useful data seeded on the network, data has gravity, people could build sort of compute networks that are able to like then leverage some of these data assets, even if like the data was kind of jumbled when it was thrown in, because it's all SIDS, you could sort of do something after the fact. I think that's sort of like the general philosophy, but I think again, everyone's got like slightly different versions of like, yeah, the history, I guess. Sorry, Danny.
Yeah, I think that does my hand ever go down? I think one of the things that's sort of interesting is that you have this moment where this thing was created, and then sort of subsequent to that, people try reinterpret what it was or what it is. And in particular, I'm not sure, like one of the things that isn't sort of recorded is whether people anticipated this as a temporary thing or not. There's a lot in the early design of Filecoin, which at least the impression I get, wasn't there, right? People going, okay, we're launching, we have all these variables and these things, and we're not quite sure, like, you know, which are the constants and which are the variables, and we might need to play around with those a little bit as we develop. And then, of course, when you launch, that gets frozen, partly because you've got other things to do, right? Like the thing is running now, so you have to chase after it. And also, as it turns out, as you build more of a community and more people using this, because we have this idea of soft consensus, right? It gets harder to change, right? Because you have to get everybody to agree with it. And I think we've seen this in a few bits of the ecosystem where we have like different things that you could potentially fiddle with, but suddenly, no pun intended, you know, fiddling with that changes people's business models, right? Changes what they anticipate happening in the future. And so I have like a number of questions that I ask people about Filecoin Plus, about what they think it should be, or how you think it should operate. And most people, I mean, have an idea of how it operates now. It's less clear like what's supposed to happen in the future, right? Is Filecoin Plus something that you launch with, and then once you I think JV's sort of implication is like once the thing is running and it's not Chia, no insult to Chia, then you can take the training wheels off. And another thing is, I think that Reba touches on, right, is that in the current iteration of it, it sort of optimizes for open data. Is that what it's, so some people feel like that Filecoin, that DataCap should be readily available to everybody who is doing a genuine deal, where genuine means not just trying to get DataCap, right? it's sort of internal to the whole thing. Other people feel, oh, this should be a way of sort of incentivizing different kinds of data on the network, right? And you should have more of a model like that, sort of a fat version of Filecoin Plus, where you use it to pull a bunch of levers, or a very thin kind of night watchman Filecoin Plus, where it's very specifically, it's very generally just to encourage things that are genuine deals. So I have questions more than answers.
Yeah, I'll do my hand first. I'm just going to give a little bit of context, and I'm not going to answer the actual question. I'm going to let the others speak. This is not firsthand. I wasn't there when Phil Plus was designed, but from at least two folks, I got the same story. Both of them are not with PL anymore. The design of Phil Plus came up when it became clear almost late 2019, when it became clear how heavy the proofs are going to be and how they are outweighing pretty much anything else that you are doing as moving data and stuff like that. These requirements came down a lot in the past 3 years, but again, snarks are in a completely different universe now than where they were in 2019. And what was recognized that it's always cheaper to not move data than move it around. So it was feared that people will never do anything aside from pledging more and more hardware. This is why the 10x multiplier was introduced, to basically encourage with the idea that we're going to solve later how to determine if usage is legitimate from the point of view of the designers at the time. And what made the 10x incongruent a little bit with the current state and the state 2 years ago of the network was that it was not anticipated just how successful this is going to be. The SpaceX network exceeded expectations by something like 50 times, if I remember correctly, if not more. And that parameter was placed in such a way that tweaking it is extremely difficult because it's tightened just with too many places, as we've seen in 36, 56, and everything associated with that. So that is the context of the changes. It was perceived from the start that folks who do not want to deal with clients will be not dealing with clients, and it was thought at the time, and certain parts of the ecosystem still think this today, that this is a existential problem for the network. So that's the context.
Yeah, I like that you went there, that we didn't anticipate how successful it would be as if it was on self-driving mode. I mean, there was control over how successful it could or couldn't be by, actual allocation of data cap. Less so nowadays, but in the past. So I think it was an intentional choice. I mean, it didn't just happen. There was a strategy that led to its success. And we can disagree on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it doesn't just happen accidentally.
What I was referring to, that it was successful at launch in terms of just how much hardware flooded the network with people who would not want to deal with data in the first place. This part was completely unforeseen, and it wasn't really controllable either. The Phil Plus kind of ramp up, and you can see this on any chart that you're looking at, started towards the end of 21, spring of 22.
Maybe as I have a question, I put it in the chat. This feels like for this group at least, to me, at the end of the day, a lot of this really just comes down to what is one's theory of sustainability for the network. So I'd actually be curious because there's one view which is Filecoin should subsidize a lot of stuff, and I think subsidies sort of make sense if you're, I guess, saying hey, there's we're loss leading with X thing because we think it's going to monetize in Y way. But simply just having a bunch of fiat expenditure funded by block rewards where no one is bringing cash into the ecosystem, that doesn't sound sustainable. So I'm also curious, how do people on this call, regardless of what the initial intent is, it's how do you sort of view sustainability for the network, regardless of what Phil Plus should be for or not be for? What is the stasis, stability for the ecosystem?
So I guess there's, and I'm going back to maybe Danny's point. I think the question of do we expect Phil Plus to be a thing that is widely available versus is it this tightly controlled thing is a bit more mechanistic, or it's this tactics thing. And so I think we get to there later. That if we just have that discussion now, we're probably not going to then be able to back out a useful path. And that's first we need this philosophical alignment of what is good, and then we can think through the mechanisms of the right ways to get there. So and so I worry that if we start trying to say the right way to deploy this mechanism is that we make it widely available or whatever, we just end up in the weeds and in a discussion that we don't necessarily get something out of. I think the other thing I've heard for how we ended up at the mechanism that we have, and again, I didn't come into sort of like paying deep attention to Phil Plus until quite recently, like this year even, is that the 10x multiplier that got chosen provides a incentive balance to try and say what we want the stable state of the network to be is something like 10% committed capacity compared to 90% of data. And so if you want that balance where your more expensive quantity is of the data is the majority, you set a multiplier to get to a steady state around there. You want some committed capacity still so that there's growth to grow into that's already pledged. But you're trying to say that, and I think, you know, that's one theory. I think it's also simultaneously addressing this issue that real data is going to cost more. But I don't think it's trying to say real data costs 10x more. That seems both very variable and hard to really quantify with a multiplier of like what is that additional operations plus bandwidth plus customer development plus whatever. I think, yeah, that we just sort of chose something, but I think the choice came as much from we know it costs more, what's the sort of like fractional distribution we want to end up at in an ideal world, which is something we can sort of guess at a little bit more cleanly. It's unclear that setting that multiplier, and I think everyone's like, well, this is a very rigid mechanism that we now have to work with. That's not necessarily, in retrospect, what we would like to have worked with. But it's the thing that got given, right? Or that got sort of encoded, and now the program has developed given that it has access to that.
So I want to differentiate two things that are very, probably very unintentionally jumbled together. What is usage of the network and sustainability of the network from a network perspective? So what we put in a Messari report or whatever it is, and what it is from a storage provider perspective. Being based in very bureaucratic Germany, being mostly connected with EU or EU exposed storage providers, I can tell you that showing up on any of the dashboards, so to speak, is an absolute no-go for most of the SPs who have clients from this region. So the sustainable perspective of a client from around here, and actually myself as well, I do have a lot of data around my CC connections that I will never put on Filecoin in its current state, because of privacy concerns, because of visibility concerns and stuff like that. But the general gist is the following. A client wants to pay, ideally without being exposed that they paid. The SP generally doesn't want to take payment for storage. They want to take payment for retrieval with some kind of micropayment-ish thing. And of course, this varies, but the idea of you store once and you retrieve forever for free, which is kind of where the network found itself, is effectively unsustainable, especially in a retail environment. So if we had something between like two data centers, you can kind of do that because peering and all this kind of stuff. But most of the clients are medium to large enterprises, which do not have free bandwidth at all, neither on the SP side nor on the client side. And so to answer your question, JB, from the group that I'm kind of mostly associated with, Fuel Plus itself is friction that gets in the way of a simple content addressable, not IPFS, content addressable. That's a very big difference. Content addressable storage and content addressable retrieval with some kind of micropayment for retrieval, or retrieval plans with, you know, the way you have data on your phone, this kind of stuff.
So, without taking Reba's bait about what is IPFS and content addressing, I guess maybe a way to, I kind of want to like push on JV's question a little bit more, to see how close we are in the, how close this group is in alignment, is like what the paying for consensus, i.e. people to like have enough storage power to make the network safe and keep their computers on and submit the proofs and mine blocks and such, how that gets paid for as the block rewards become, there's a limited number of blocks, they get paid off in some decaying way. So as the block rewards become worth like 0 sandwiches, which is maybe another way of saying steady state, right? But as they become worth 0 units of paying for like an egg salad sandwich, like how the consensus is paid for, and see if that's like, are we in the same place?
I mean, that's kind of the $1 million question, not just for Filecoin, right? I mean, it's very unclear that most blockchains are sustainable in the absence of block rewards right now. I mean, obviously, a lot of these systems are still relatively young in their lifetime, and you know, there's a lot of room to grow. But you know, eventually, you need to look at the sources of protocol revenue, right? And that is in most cases transaction processing. So you can aim to be sustainable based on that alone once block rewards are out. In a system like Filecoin, that's further complicated by a lot of the transactions being signaling traffic from the network itself. So, and in particular paid for by the same people, that's by the miners, right? By the storage providers that are receiving the other transaction fees, and so they are consumers themselves, and so it becomes quite complicated to predict whether that balance can be achieved or when it will be achieved. But it all comes down to usage, right? I mean, if you do have a thriving system that people use and in which people, you know, in this case, store data and transact, then of course you will be able to generate revenue. I don't think that's necessarily our immediate concern. I mean, block rewards are not going away. I mean, they are dwindling, but they are not going away anytime soon. So I don't think we need to solve that ahead of you know, everyone else. But it's definitely an important question.
I'll let JV go first.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe just like reframe, because I don't know if I necessarily agree with the last comment. I think the reason it matters is because like inflation is dilution, right? Like if you're not staked, like you are slowly losing your ownership share of the Phil network. And I think like the reason it sort of matters is like, unlike many other networks, like other proof of work networks or networks that have large fiat expenditures, like without bringing like paid like services in to like fund the hardware, like the implication is it has to be funded through like sold block rewards, right? So like for the network, like basically if we don't have like real use cases coming in, then like we sort of are in a different position than I think other networks. Proof of stake networks, generally speaking, like if you were to, I don't know if anyone's actually built this as like a math thing, but it would be good to show like what is the aggregate network expenditure to like fund its hardware. For something like Ethereum, where like you can run a solo validator at home, basically rounding error of cost, like the amount of effective issuance you need to like maintain that hardware is basically 0. So it's more like how bullish and what is like the people's long-term like positive sentiment about Ethereum that they're willing to like stake and like put capital at risk. For something like Solana, it's actually different, right? Because like Solana, high performance blockchain, must run it in a data center. Like this is the thing that ETH people bash Solana on the head for quite often, where it's like, oh, in order to be a profitable validator, you need to, and this is also why, for what it's worth, a lot of the Solana validators also run RPC businesses as like a side hustle, because it's like, hey, if you're running all this stuff anyways, at least you can monetize the service in another way. Filecoin is like a further logical extent of the Solana story in a sense of like our block producers are even more expensive to maintain. But the hope, I would think, is that like, yes, there's more monetizable services, those cash flow, like if the software works well enough that you can like cash flow and have some third-party customer pay for like other services that you're rendering, then like consensus doesn't necessarily need to be the funder, but you also have something that can like help bootstrap that hardware to begin with. So you get out of this like chicken and egg problem. But yeah.
Yeah, I love these two comments were made because they're both wrong. In the sense that the assumption that the Filecoin storage provider setup is expensive is incorrect. A Filecoin SP, the initial onboarding of the drives, not of the data, of the drives themselves, is expensive, but it can be outsourced. And especially given recent research, the onboarding of a certain container is effectively secure forever. Something like 140 years, I believe, was the so forever enough. And the POREP step, and then for everything else, the actual calculation of the window post and winning post arcs and so on and so forth, they themselves are cheap enough to literally be done in a single computer in your basement. What is not free is the actual storage, but the storage part is reusable. So if, for example, you are if you are let's say CERN, who is trying to monetize their hot storage that they have to have anyway, and they're called backup, so the two things, they can do this for free because the data is available anyway, and the consensus sampling that happens every 30 minutes for different parts of this stuff is something that is extremely light once things are up. So the concept that our consensus is actually expensive, that notion is incorrect. We're much closer to Ethereum than anything else in this space. That's number one. And number two, our block rewards are also like their decay is something on the magnitude of a century. So it doesn't help us with where we are today worrying about that part. So that's my 2 cents.
I mean, let me just address two things you said. I think there's one cost that you haven't listed, which is relevant, which is acquiring the collateral necessary for the storage, and that's with a 10 times multiplier is 10 times more expensive. So that's something to take into account. The other thing is, regardless of the local computational cost of proofs, you do have the on-chain messages, which right now are essentially free because there's lots of chain space, right? But if the chain were to become congested, if there were to be thriving usage, then those obviously also become more expensive. That said, as has been said multiple times, we have significantly optimized things since the early days. So, and it will continue to be optimized. So this is not necessarily the end of the world, but we shouldn't take current costs on a given the current context of basically free gas to be meaningful of the system that we want to have.
Maybe just also on, I think there's maybe, I wasn't necessarily referring to like the current state with Ceiling as a service. I do think there is something separate there, Reba, of like the thing that you're describing of like a CERN. It's like CERN is spending on data center infrastructure. So that's like cost that they have. I guess the right question is like, if you have a net new miner, which I actually think I don't know what proportion of our miners are data centers that already have existing things and they're just monetizing like by getting extra block rewards. So like they may be doing the marginal thing to like make it Filecoin consensus-y and then getting block rewards as a result. But if you're talking about like what is the net new miner doing, like net new miner is also like inclusive of like I have no deals, I wasn't planning on spending for these hard drives anyways. Like all of that is I think things that if we're trying to do like the accounting correctly would have to like be on their own. But yeah, I also don't know. Like it's hard for me to imagine if someone has 100 petabytes of, or I don't know, tens of petabytes that is like of net new hardware, or even like used hardware that they have spun up in whatever data center, that is comparable to the Ethereum cost of like running a solo validator at home. But I also do not have specific numbers, so you probably are closer to that than I.
Yeah, where I was going with this is that the servicing of the storage is comparable to Ethereum. So what you actually need to do the snarks, to do the sampling, and so on and so forth. The storage itself, of course, costs stuff. But the storage itself is designed in such a way, ideally with some kind of proof clear data in the future, that it is a cost on top of something. It's already a realized cost. So if you're an USP, you either have someone already that you're storing for, or yourself, or if you're an USP just getting in, the software should get to a point. Curio is trying to get in this direction. More work needs to be done there. But the point is that even if you're an USP and you just enter like a Chia, with a Chia mindset, and you look at all this stuff, it's spinning, it's earning you whatever block rewards, and then you go like, oh, but I can actually use this for something else in addition without changing any of my other infrastructure. That's kind of the point. Two more comments. Collateral today is overwhelmingly borrowed with kind of cross collateralizing and so on and so forth, where an SP has is shifting a good percentage of the exposure to the staking business. So stake today is not a problem for any SP that I know. They can, on the drop of the hat, just find whatever field they need. After the stuff on FEM took place. The problem is data cap. It continues to be. Again, if you look on Slack, people are not asking at all, where do I find fill? Like, where do I find data cap? For the field I already have, already can borrow, and so on and so forth. And to George's point, I still maintain that the chain is actually cheap enough, even in high gas situations, because Filecoin is sufficiently efficient that all of these messages that we process, they do not land in the state, they do not take additional storage space, and we do a lot of the stuff optimistically to a point where even if gas were literally 10 million higher than it is today, it is still rounding error to do your window posts and winning posts. It's onboarding new data, onboarding new containers, new sectors, which is expensive, but again, you do this once for a number of years. So
yeah, I guess two things that I think are the nuances on the points you just made, or interpretations. As you say, coming in as an SP or as a data set that already exists and that you want to get the sort of additional incentive of incorporating Filecoin isn't expensive. I think there's a question also of, is that valuable to Filecoin? And how valuable do we, and I think we haven't really, we don't have a good sense of that necessarily, but like the traditional storage ecosystem-ish thing, right, is like, if I just want to store some data, I don't know, on your computer, it's probably pretty cheap. Or just like some computer, I want to store some data, I can probably get a pretty cheap quote, right? There's some VPS out there that'll let me store data pretty cheaply. And when it starts to cost a little bit more is when there's these SLAs, and when you get to the like 99.9, like that number of nines, and the compliance of the data center that's in and things like that actually increase some long tail costs. And so there's this question, I think, also of, are those two as valuable? And do we have a way where we want to differentiate that? Or is that purely from what a client's going to pay of the services? And Filecoin is totally agnostic, and none of the Filecoin economy is going to reflect that providing that sort of higher, like we don't have a clear sense of where the bar is. And so what we're incentivizing is the cheapest possible storage as a result. Because if we're saying these are all equal from the perspective of consensus, from the perspective of all of these things, we're sort of ignoring that cost differentiator and the equivalent service differentiator that goes with it. That was, I think, the earlier point. And then just now, or then your subsequent point, Ripa, was around Fill Plus and data cap is the thing that you see clients coming and saying that they need, where it's not Fill, but it's data cap that is this sort of resource that's adding the friction. I think there is one nuance there for me, which is, I think in general, when we see that, my interpretation often is that that is people coming in who don't have a data set already. So it's not that they need Fill Plus necessarily, but I see that often as a proxy of they need clients and they need biz dev support. Because if there is a data set, that often is then, and they're coming from a perspective of, I want to get this data and I want to get this. There's paths to get the data cap through that, it seems like. And they've got the money from a client coming in, where often that I need data cap is coming from someone who's like, hey, I want to just spin up some storage. And they haven't thought through but I need the client and I need someone to be paying for that storage. And so what they're looking for is some of that matchmaking and like, how do I actually, like, what is it that I'm actually doing here in some sense? That it's often earlier in that cycle. And Fill Plus is just the first thing where they realize, oh wait, the network is incentivizing not just committed capacity to be profitable here. I need clients, I need some data. And so like, initially we would, the easy answer is great. Like, let's set up a program like Slingshot or something that subsidizes this. And we've got a much harder to articulate answer right now, which is like, well, let's find some clients. Here's some various options of like pathways or people that we'll try and put you in touch with who can maybe find the active clients or whatever. But right, like if we had a ton of client demand of data sets of people who wanted to pay money and we could do a matchmaking, I think we would find somewhat less friction at the Fill Plus level. Because if you've got that stream of clients who are doing it, I have to imagine, or I don't know if I have to imagine, ideally you would then optimize for that to happen, right? Like that you've got money coming in means you've got money to throw at making a process that can avoid that friction. And I don't think it takes that much money to get around the friction. So maybe that's the hypothesis where I'm wrong. And if that's true, we can describe it. But I mean, my understanding is that the current market price of data cap is not that high in the gray market compared to like if we're looking at how much data cap per PIB, like people might pay on a gray market. My suspicion here is, again, if you've got inbound client money that you're doing to set this up, that's not so high today that you're in pain. And then that trickles into people getting a better deal. And so it sort of reinforces itself with the price going down through that. Okay, I will stop.
What you described works exclusively for clients and storage providers, mostly storage providers that are dealing with this, because clients, number one, do not know, and number two, do not want to know about how this happens. SPs effectively use their consensus providing as an additional subsidy for their service. But all of this, everything that you described requires them to cut you in, kind of like the Apple Store. And people don't like that for obvious reasons, right? But we don't need to go into why. Let's say I am an SP. I can talk to certain German SPs. I can talk to certain Dutch SPs. I can speak to certain Belgian SPs and certain Belarusian SPs. We don't want to, you as Fiddle, we don't want to give you our customer list. Why would we ever do that? And here comes the friction. Like, how do I make it look like I have actual clients and make it look like I am storing actual data instead of just generating stuff? Like what was done in Sixtual, after the fact, like after I left PL, a number of folks like came to me and like, hey, you know what we were doing? We were actually having this like random number generators that we were like moving around so everybody would generate the right stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I knew you were doing that, but I couldn't prove it. But how do I make it look that I'm not doing that without ever telling you what am I actually doing? Because I'm under contractual obligations to never tell you that. And if that's not friction, I don't know what is.
I can so I can give you the evolutionary answer that is the current theory, at least that as I understand it, and maybe that's a useful place for this like current trajectory discussion that we've moved into. The thought is that the overall program is identifying mechanisms of evaluating basically exactly that. How is this a real data set? And there's probably different ways to do that. And so the thought is that allocators will come, and the goal of these different allocators is to evolve to different evaluation mechanisms for identifying is something good data. And then as you have that, you would look at overall network health metrics associated with the subsets to identify which ones should be sort of growing. And so I think that's exactly right, which is what are ways that you can identify that something is a legitimate value add to the network, that it isn't just a random number generator. And I think it's a pretty low bar, like you're saying, in terms of what is good data here, where it really is like, let's make sure that this isn't just someone who's doing committed capacity and claiming to be not committed capacity, or effectively committed capacity in some sense. And so the reason that we look at it right now and we're like, oh, this is a set of metrics that are optimizing for probably not what we want, is because that's like the easiest. Like it's the low-hanging fruit got low-hanging fruited first, and then the network really oriented around that. And the low-hanging fruit was, well, let's say we've got these public data sets and we'll store them in multiple places. That seems like something that then we can sort of point to as like, look at these cool data sets. And we've really grown that evaluation structure. But that doesn't, and so there's some others that we could imagine that are also like clearly value adds to the network. Like, can you talk about locked up collateral? That if these are either on-chain deals or there's a client that is paying for this, then you can show that by pointing to the transactions that are associated with that data getting sealed, and you haven't like actually revealed anything about the clients, but you have indicated that these are paid deals in some sense. Now, how do you differentiate that from just more speculation? That becomes hard, and I think that's why that and any demonstration there, that complexity of is there something that helps better differentiate a speculative actor versus someone who's demonstrating their paid deals, is like one of the things where you look at it and you're like, maybe this is more complicated. And like, I think that doesn't mean that we shouldn't experiment with it. I think we should. But I think, if we see everything then orient towards that, we're going to then need to figure out, okay, did we just do this again? Which is the unfortunate like part of that. I think there's been thoughts of like, could you say, we'll have some random third-party auditor, these international Ernst & Young or Procter & Gamble is going to show that this client has real customers, right? Like, you don't need to show anything, but like you've shown to the network through some trusted third party, of which, there's a lot of external audit firms that have some reputation, that this entity is storing proportional to the number of clients and the amount of money that they have. And you haven't really revealed much beyond that. But that is now a thing that is hard for someone who's just doing committed capacity to get a, auditor with reputation to make that statement. And again, that's a cost, but I don't know, an audit is a thing that a lot of businesses do every year anyway. And so maybe that's not that much cost relative to these other things. So that could be an evaluation form. That seems like a pretty hard to fake one, but it's, is there willingness to experiment with that? If there is, I think, Phil Plus is happy to see that as an evaluation mechanism. And so then the question is, are there other evaluation mechanisms that we can imagine that would be good differentiators? And if so, let's do them. And then B, is that going to be like a fast enough evolutionary trajectory, or are we in a place where we're just sort of going to end up in stasis because there's, I don't know, well, because.
Yeah, everything you're saying makes sense when you put us in a context of we need to measure storage in some way. And I actually have a question for JV. That's great. He has the next hand. Do you care about this? Because you already know the storage is happening. You already know what collateral is locked. You already you know that the hardware is there. That's kind of like the whole brilliance of Filecoin, that you know exactly that the hard drives are there and there is no way to fake that. What my understanding is that you care about at this point is not whether people pay for storage or not. Like, it doesn't matter. What matters is, are people doing other stuff with this data? Are they retrieving it? Maybe they're doing compute like Fluence or something like that. But are we even like, what I'm getting at is, Will, you are stating a problem, and I keep repeatedly saying, like, is this a problem real? Is this the kind of metric that an investor, a user cares about in the first place? Because if we all focus on storage, which is what we have been doing for the past 3 years, we can lose track of all the other stuff. Like today, if I want to, if I'm an SP and I want to charge my client for a retrieval, I literally have no software solution for this at all. Not a single thing out there works, even on calibration net, let alone on mainnet. So that seems like a problem. But JB, what do you think? I'm
so glad you're
if you got the
seeing
wish
this up.
list, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you're seeing this up, because I had a couple reactions to Will's thing. Like, I think we're over-engineering, like we've moved down the logical path to, like, because we are talking about Phil Plus, we're sort of presuming that Phil Plus is the solution to the problem. And I think we should recurse back one step. And like, I think there was a problem that Phil Plus was intended to solve. I think it is worth asking, like, if we started from the problem, what are the potential slated solutions? I actually don't think it's as specific to like, people care about retrieval or compute. People want like a real proxy that people like show Filecoin has product market fit. Product market fit means there's someone who's willing to pay for a service. It doesn't actually matter which service, but one of the services on the network. If someone wants long-term archival storage, fantastic. Show me that they're willing to pay for it, and there's a market clearing price where that actually like is providing real value to them. And like, that could be a premium, it could be a discount. I know people have different philosophies of like what the market wants. I think it doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is like, someone wants to pay for it. I think actually Phil Plus has in some ways like muddied a lot of the conversation, because even when you have like, I don't know, take as an example, like some of these large enterprise deals that Seal has been like really pushing on, like, I think the market doesn't really give it as much, people give it credit because it's like a real institution, but it's like, if they haven't really sent dollars over something, whether it's over a wire or whether it's over the blockchain or whatever, to pay for that service, like, yes, lots of things people will do for free, but like, who actually cares? And so I would generalize, Reba, it's not people see payment for storage, people see payment is like the thing. It could be for storage, it could be for retrieval, it could be for compute, but people pay because Filecoin is offering a valuable service of some form. One note I wanted to make, Will, on your like proposal, I had actually brought this up a while ago, and I think I forgot around when. This must have been at least a year ago. Like, I think there is also a scalability question that we should be thinking about for like the longevity of the network. Facebook, as like a many billion-dollar corporation, employs tens of thousands of moderators to try to like automatically do all their trust and safety stuff, and they fail. Like, I mean, they do a good job, but not perfect. I think it's like worth pointing out that there is a limit to humans cannot solve these problems, and we're talking about like things that are in exponentials. And so like I do think like we could, if like we could add more and more systems. I don't think that's necessarily good or bad, but I would also like just pose like at some point we will have to contend that these things are going to scale past what you could hire Ernst & Young or KPMG or whoever for. And like we could come up with more and more systems, but I do think like when I think of the end state of Filecoin, it has to be like permissionless. And like I thought Reba brought up another point, which is important, where it's like part of the implication, at least at the beginning of Phil Plus, was like the point of Phil Plus is to make this Schelling point around working with clients. And I think the implication is like because there's such a strong incentive vector for people to like work with clients, that will foster the creation of a bunch of other software and stuff that will make it more possible for that to scale. I think it's worth, like I will assert, I think like we should decouple incentive problems versus software problems, because like incentive problems, people will do what is like the thing that we've seen, which is like try to game the system and stuff like that. Like it doesn't necessarily lead to the creation of software. And I think like, yeah, like part of my, I think like a little bit of frustration of seeing the Phil Plus debate go for so long is like, we're arguing about a lot of like ways that we could fine tune a system, but we're still like we would be better spent if all the intellectual capital went into like make the retrievables work, like make the other stuff work. Because like I remember last year, like so okay, in my view of like what makes a network sustainable, like one way you could sort of observe like a boom and a bust cycle panning out is like what happened with this massive expansion of the network to 15 exabytes. But if you don't have paid cash flows into the network, eventually token holders are just going to dump, and like we will ride our way all the way back down to like sub 3 or whatever the low was. And like ultimately all the network providers that are just here for like hardware and not paying users like will get washed out. Like if we actually had spent from the last two whatever I forgot whatever the timeframes are, but like if we had paid retrievals, at least the providers, like eventually the Schelling point has to be like that the like getting paid services is the most sustainable way to run these mining operations. That only is possible if there's like high quality open source software that enables them to just say like, I can accept deals and service this without having to touch stuff. And like, I think we're still pretty far from that. And so even for this call, we have 6 very smart people, or at least 5. I will not include myself in there. We have 5 very smart people on this call. It's like, I do think worthwhile asking like, are we, yeah, like sort of dancing around like the actual harder problem, which is like, how do we just make the stuff work? And like, is Phil Plus actually getting us closer or further, or just like laterally away from the goal?
Yeah, I want to be first to go. Of course, that you know, to +1 this or sort of thing. They're going like this. That one of the, I think my version of this is, you know, one of the dangers with building incentives is you just get into kind of a friction spiral where you're trying to like divert the river this way. So you're building up something to try and stop people going this way. And you're just building up friction in the whole system, right? You're building essentially a bureaucracy, right? And the other way of doing it, right, is to make the direction that you want to go easier and easier. And I think my internal model for the sort of, and this isn't really about how you necessarily build a decentralized storage network, but kind of how you build a decentralized storage network that takes advantage of the features that everybody has built and is the expertise of the Filecoin network. And that is you make it automatable, right? You make really good software that means that you just go on the network and you're making deals, right? I think that one of the, to me at least, a sort of interesting surprise earlier on is that we were creating these SPs that were also kind of going and finding clients and making SLA deals and these kind of things. And that's fine. Like that's definitely a way that you would build something like this. But the other way is that, you know, it's a Go script for making money, right? Like you run the thing and like the deals come to you and all you have to do is set a price. And so it feels to me that all the solutions we should be driving towards are to make that the optimal thing. That once you start offering storage on the network, then the other parts of it, as you say, sort of to the extent that things can be done in software, they get done. And so when we get into like the thing of going, well, it's fine because like Ernst & Young, this isn't a diss, by the way, but like if it's Ernst & Young auditing, right, that is definitely how you might build a system like this. I feel like a lot of people want to join a network like this so that they don't have to deal with Ernst & Young and they don't have to be that kind of organization. And so I definitely feel like moving the incentives towards creating the good software, trying to work out what the bumps are on that, which means that the water doesn't go that way, it goes that way, is the sort of most pressing thing.
Okay. Cool. So I guess let me. I started writing down some of these points that I wanted to respond to, because we're in that mode of roundtable at this point, I guess. JV, you were talking about like, let's get retrievals working and like utility. I think one thing I found interesting of the last 3 months, or sort of as Fiddle has come into existence, is we changed the SID checker tool that sort of, when an allocator says, hey, how is this client, what has this client done so far? And like, what's the deal making? I gave them data cap, what's happened? That tool had been using a subsystem called RetrievalBot that would attempt to get the data back occasionally and would say whether it was able to get it. And what we saw was that a lot of SPs had just sort of whitelisted the one AWS IP of that RetrievalBot. That RetrievalBot was able to make its one download and was able to check off the green box. And that was the extent that retrievals were incentivized by the program. When we changed that compliance report, which is just a markdown file, it doesn't like then go anywhere further except that it is now this thing that is associated with the program and that other people can sort of point at. And to use Spark data that is coming from a set of station nodes that are, you know, not using one IP address, right? I'm not saying this is like perfect yet, but it's one step closer to needing some more subsystems. Like it goes to IPNI, so you have to publish an index for it to work, and then a set of one or more nodes will then try and download it, and you don't necessarily as cheaply know what IPs those are coming from. We've had a ton of people actually start publishing data to IPNI, and we've seen that go up. So like the IPNI publisher metrics of number of publishers have gone up a huge amount in the last month as a, I think, somewhat result of people being like, oh, this is what retrieval is. So I think we have a lever where if it's the, you know, let's be, I don't know, a little less lazy in building these tooling systems, we can end up incentivizing things. So it's an imperfect metric, but there are ways to incentivize things. And I think a bunch of the work is trying to get to subsystems that incentivize things that are closer to what we forecast as being valuable to clients and customers. And then you were also talking about, well, does this scale? And so I guess the thing I would point to there is I think the hope is more and more of this can be moved on chain and fully automatic. Like I think you know, if we end up staying in an evolutionary mode, it's going to be through fully automatic distribution. There's already a bunch of allocator smart contract getting developed, soon to be security audited and then being piloted. And so those will be providing, for instance, any SP that has a high Spark retrieval rate can have deals to it be data capped. And so what that means is a client, instead of just directly making the deal, if they send the message to the allocator smart contract, it will then proxy them to the subset of SPs that it has on its list from Spark. And so that there's a set of these things where we can move more of this policy as we get to things that we think are reasonable metrics of like this is a valuable subset to not require nearly as much intervention, because the actual diligence that we're seeing from the manual evaluation is not really better than what we can encode in smart contracts, right? Like if the extent of what the evaluation that's happening through things like the SID checker feedback loop process is great. This deal got made to 2 SPs and like as expected. And like we see the same PCID on multiple places. Like that is a thing that a smart contract can also do, and we don't need humans in the loop. So we are attempting, I think, to say let's focus on things that are, and I don't think that's like unachievable at the same time. And then Danny, you had a couple points as well. So are we just adding friction versus are we making the right direction easy? I think this is probably at the heart of things. I'm not like sure that the mechanism we have, which is, and by mechanism I mean data cap and this 10x multiplier, is setting us up for success, right? Like we've got this fairly inflexible mechanism, and it seems like it is incentivizing a race to the bottom in some sense, which is what is the cheapest way I can get to that 10x multiplier. Like we're incentivizing the like, I want to get that one bump and I want to do the least work I can to get that one bump. And that doesn't seem like that's actually what we want. Like you could imagine that there would be ways to say, I want to give the top performers something, or that you've got some gradiated thing where you can get a race to better quality and better support for the network. So, you know, we're experimenting with that, or not, Filecoin as an ecosystem is experimenting with things like RetroPGF or things like that as a hope to maybe that those can incentivize top performers. I think we'll see if that is effective in doing so, but you could imagine that there are other mechanisms that might structure that game in a better way. And then the other one that I was interested in, Danny, is your posit that an SP should be able to show up and just like say run and make money and shouldn't have to do BD. I think my thought here is that there really is not going to be a one size fits all. Like it's not that that's the only, that's not the only case, because there are, and B, like, I would probably guess that for the bulk of clients and the bulk of value that we are trying to capture, it's not people who just want to store on someone who's done that in their basement, right? Like if I look at the money going into storage, I'm not sure that there's a meaningful fraction of that storage market that would be addressed by someone who hasn't really done more than like, I set up this rig in my basement, right? Like it's great that you've invested a bunch in storage, and maybe that amount that you've invested in storage plus collateral is enough to make you think about things like having the right UPS and having a long-term network connection. But I think there is something more that most clients are going to want in terms of both an expectation of retrieval, which they don't necessarily know from someone having turned it on and setting and pressing run. And I think as you get to the people who are paying in bulk, there's often things around an SLA that is not encoded fully in what the Filecoin, like, great, I know you are going to store this for a year and a half. That's pretty cool. But I think the things of like, well, could you snap it over to other deals? And so actually change my data out earlier is something that we're still figuring out. Like certainly enterprises are wanting that sometimes, but at the same time, there's clients who might not. And then secondly, great, like my data center caught on fire, I need this now. Am I going to get it now? And am I going to get it at a pre-negotiated price? Ends up being often a pretty important thing that ends up then needing an out-of-band interaction in advance between prospective clients and servers to make sure they meet up, that is not mediated through Filecoin. And so we need to figure out how we make that mediation not painful, and how, you know, from as an SP comes in and presses run, what they're able and willing and are going to be responsive in doing so that you can match make appropriate clients and that they can get an appropriate set of value. I think that's everything I have.
I think Reba, you were first.
I want you to respond first, and then I have other thoughts.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to clarify a point. I'm not saying that we necessarily weren't doing the stuff before. I know people have been working on this. I actually think the same point I was making about like, what is the outcome that we're trying to shoot for, and Phil Plus is one solution, and like taking a step back to say like, what are the potential slate of solutions? I think the same thing actually applies for retrieval. I am less close on the technical side. I know I've talked to Reba before, who had some opinions how like, here are simpler ways we could have attempted retrieval. And to me, at least, it's more about like, the scoreboard is like people can pay for services on the network, being less opinionated about what does that actually mean? Because like my view is this network is like, I mean, I don't think it's controversial to say pre-product market fit. There's like early sprouts of like, hey, there's some interesting stuff happening, but like we have not hit mainstream adoption. Like in order for us all to like extend the option for the ecosystem writ large to like maintain all the intellectual capital, the hardware, everything, like we need capital inflows, because then like we can actually start building real like things, and it's also less expensive for the ecosystem to invest in growth. I had like earlier this year been making like a little campaign. I think people saw it or might have seen like a blog post I wrote about this. Like I think if we were to like ask external people, like what are the 3 things that like would be the most like highest leverage things for the ecosystem to prove, like show paid activity, and paid deals is not implying just storage. It's like all the services of the network. On-chain activity, so like Filecoin as an L1 coming into its own. I think all the DeFi stuff is actually like in that bucket to show like, hey, there is demand for the services that this network can offer, and there's like unique stuff going on. And then 3 is just like high-profile integrations. And I think one could interpret that as just the Web 2. I think over the long term, it's like we have to eat into Web 2 to be sustainable. But I also think like getting integrations and like success cases inside of Web 3 where the bar is lower. Like a lot of people are like spiritually aligned with using stuff in Web 3. And I think like without having other advocates who, and this is I think why the Solana thing had such a like stark reaction on Twitter when like that sort of happened, is because I think people want to see this stuff work and like they're excited to see it happen, but like it can't be that the friction makes it so high that like it takes months of Onjor specifically embedding to like figure it out. Like it needs to get dramatically lower. So to me, it's actually much more about like, what is our focus as a network? Like if we have spare resources and we're like expending it on other things, it's not that we couldn't do that, but like we still haven't found the happy path that like allows us to just print cash. Like I would argue actually to George's earlier point, most blockchains don't have this. Like I think Solana, for better or for worse, like meme coins are that to start. And like, I think they're trying to make DePIN writ large that for them over the long term. But like, this is actually like the fundamental question of every blockchain ecosystem. And I think Filecoin is a unique bet, but like for us to get distracted and not focus rigorously on like, what are the like long-term, like the things that extend our option, and like not invest all of our like energy towards that, we're like sort of like reducing the probability of our own success. But yeah.
Yeah, no, this is kind of like where I wanted to go. Most of the folks on this call are old enough and Americanish. You remember PriceWatch.com? This is where we are. And what we're trying to build is an Amazon where everybody goes to one place and buys things from a standardized interface and so on and so forth. But we're not there because we don't know what was it that we're selling. We're in the PriceWatch.com days, even a little bit before that. We're pets.com almost. And being able to explore all of this by independent teams is what makes or breaks some of the things. Like even today, even though Amazon.com exists, Newegg is still there. And you go and compare hardware like you used to 15 years ago. And storage is a commodity, just like PC hardware used to be, and even more so today, but it was 20 years ago. What we need is to fuck around and find out. And we are not doing this because everything is kind of like put on these rails of, semantic web 3.0, like everything IPLD, car files, everything needs to be full plus, everything needs to be like checkable, verifiable by third parties. There needs to be various stakes in case of, an SP runs away. It needs to be replicated because, just like in DHT, because if one node goes out and stuff like that. The market doesn't give a shit about any of this because the market doesn't even know what they can do with this today. They don't fully understand what content addressability really gives them. They don't fully understand what the snarks that we run every 24 hours, what do they actually prove? Like there is not a single thing anywhere on any docs that says you actually get a tangible thing. Nobody in kind of like the Web3 world, in the blockchain world, understands that we're effectively the only blockchain that has a complete, unfalsifiable certificate every 24 hours of all the hardware that is being used in it. There's nothing like this existing like anywhere else. And yet we narrowed ourselves, tunnel vision, into, Field Plus, data, the botnet that is Spark, accessing it, not telling customers about it because that would be bad. It's not like the meme where somebody's riding a bicycle and they're putting the stick in it. That's what we're doing. And the message isn't like my message isn't that stop what you're doing, whoever is doing it. Zen Ground wants to do further development on contracts, that do deals automatically. By all means, yes. And Will, you want to figure out how to carve a certain niche that does publicly verifiable retrieval and storage? By all means. I want to do stuff for very privacy-oriented individuals. It should be able to do that too. Somebody else wants to do CC only. By all means, who cares? In closing, I'll bring my my favorite example. You all use email. Like this is how this meeting happened. 90, I don't know how many % of it is spam. Does anyone give a shit? No, because we between ourselves can use it. And spam filters that keeps everything else available for everybody. But the utilization of the system has nothing to do with its usefulness. And I think this is what we kind of lost as a spirit in general in PL land, so to speak.
Yeah, I just want to agree entirely with what you said and what JV said before, right? I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but you all know the quotes. You show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes, right? And I think we put all of our incentive eggs in one basket, to use a bad mix of analogies, right? And we focus so much on this, and it was well intentioned. I mean, there was, but it just we just had tunnel vision, and so I do think that we may have missed the forest for the tree and stifled a lot of innovation that could have happened in the network in different directions. And nothing is lost. I mean, we can still have that, right? But we really need to expand our perspectives and look beyond whatever definition or single program. So yeah, I think that's critically important. I do think that the other thing, and this is a reflection from a while back, but we were talking about progressively more complicated mechanisms, or at least heavier mechanisms to validate certain things, whether some measure of whether data is valuable or whether some activity is valuable to the network or not. And that kind of reminded me of Gitcoin. I mean, Gitcoin is also a project that is incredibly well-intentioned. Gitcoin has a problem. It started with a broken incentive model. Quadratic funding or quadratic voting is the most Sybil prone mechanism that you can come up with. And so it shouldn't be used in open settings. It should be used in closed voting settings, but it was used in an open setting. And for 20 rounds after, each time they would publish a retro saying, oh yeah, we found these new attack vectors. And therefore you have 4 more mechanisms for the next round. And it became increasingly more complex to participate with Gitcoin Passport, and you need to validate your account in 20 different ways and whatnot. And, you know, like the idea is good, like the goals are good, but if you require this many layers of complexity on top of it, maybe it's the underlying, you know, the basic incentive that needs adjustment, and I think that's valid for both cases.
Yeah, I think that you know that one of the challenges here is you build an incentive system, and if there's a shortcut, whether it's Sybils or faking something, then people will take that shortcut, right? And I think one of the open questions that I have, like I feel like we've all made kind of our standard pitch about how we think that things should be improved. And my standard question is like, well, do you want to narrow Phil Plus, you know, have that program be a small program, or do you want so it just sort of incentivizes a particular thing and you can narrow it to 0 as well, right? You can just make it go away. Or do you want to have it as a thing that incentivizes a lot of different things? And you're still picking, right? I mean, you're still picking and choosing. The sort of fuck around and find out thing is the thing that you want to incentivize in that, I think, is that the fucking around and finding out should exist within Filecoin rather than outside, right? Like people will go off and I said the word fuck too many times, but they will go off and do that somewhere if you don't do it, if you don't enable that kind of creativity within your network. So the question is like, okay, how do we encourage that kind of diversity? Because this comes back to the original issue, which is the network on its own doesn't differentiate between committing sectors and storing something else, right? So what can we create that really makes people want to do lots of different things? And I don't have an answer to that because I'm just asking questions.
I think it's already there. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, I guess
Could
for
be.
these last two, George and Danny, what you were saying about like, you know, and George in particular, you were talking about like, let's step back and look at like, are we just adding more complexity and layers versus like in having a broader breadth. And I think one of the things that this is touching on is this sort of like governance layer, which is, let's say there's some other competing way to that isn't Phil Plus. How do we decide the relative volumes? Like, is there this meta governance that we've suddenly put in, which today is the governance layer of Phil Plus to different allocators? Of like, do they get to give out data cap or some incentive? If you say, great, like what we're going to have is like, you've got sort of two things. You say either there's no multiplier, and so then it's essentially a policy of, well, great, like it's whatever your underlying cost is going to be, whether this is a larger slice of the pie or not. We're going to just sort of waive as a ecosystem our ability to shape or direct this to some extent. And so then you look at it and you'll be like, well, but the cheap way to get that block reward is something like committed capacity. And so we can look and run that experiment, but we've given up our manipulating the overall economy stick that we have today to have that control. So we are ceding power if we just sort of give it up wholesale. And so everything else then is a governance question of how do we want to use this piece of power and where do we want to have that? And I think it's a question of right now that power of being able to sort of like have that blessing of 10x or not. The top layer is a somewhat nebulous consensus-y thing around Phil+. And maybe it's better to encode that. But we should think about what that encoding is that's going to get us good outcomes. Because whether we do it in Phil+ to allocators or whether we do it as multiple different programs for incentivization, we should be intentional there. You know, maybe this is, we're going to have some sort of retro PGF and we have some set of community vote on how we want to do these incentivizations or how much they should have relative power to each other. And we have multiple stakeholders, but we're designing a governance process in some sense if we go down that route of multiple programs or multiple things, which is how, and maybe it's like, great, like who can get the funding to run a program? That's you know, whoever can have an incentive program. It's like how you've like pulled in and done that, and like you know, if you can get the money to run your fraction of the community, you can. I think then right, like we're back at this, like if we let that be self-run, then for these more expensive entities, they're going to feel like they're subsidizing the cheap ones, right? If there isn't the overall network tax going there, what you've got is, it's like, well, I could run my client business that's more expensive here, and I can like have a fund or some way to subsidize them. But that money in some sense is like getting diluted by the fact that other people can just be doing this cheaper thing of putting random ones and zeros. They've got a lower cost and they're now getting their larger slice. So why am I going into that shared block reward with them if I'm, you know, providing this value that I think is more? So we've got this tension, and so the question is, what is the governance that ends up having everyone feel like there's some fair, equitable pie slicing?
Yeah, Adin, let me jump here a little quick. So I reject this notion entirely that the tension is there. The tension is not there because the reason the gap between doing CC and doing other stuff is so large is the software is not great, to put it mildly. If things were relatively well working, then this cost of doing the extra stuff, you could just pass it onto a client and the client would pay it. Because the whole point of Filecoin is that it has the service layer, which is commoditized and on its own you cannot make it. It has the consensus layer, which is kind of also commoditized, but when you put them together, you can get a little bit from here and a little bit of here to have a profitable business. But moreover, to the point of what is actually happening on the network today versus 1 year ago, or 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago. So 1 year ago, the Phil+ denominated, so, you know, enhanced staking hardware on the network was at 4%. Today, it is at 30%. And this is accelerating because nobody is adding hardware to the network without Phil+. So either they're leaving or they're finding ways to buy Phil+, data cap, and so on and so forth. And moreover, this 30%, it doesn't sound like much, but because of how the math works out, this 30% are currently taking 82% of all the block rewards in the network, compared to the other 70% that are just, you know, letting stuff expire because they don't want to get fined for the collateral and stuff like that. So the point I'm making here is that while we're discussing this, everything is data cap. Therefore, anything on the Filecoin network is Phil+. FIP is being applied in a glacial way. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I think it's in some of the comments that have been like the last few folks that went. I just want to sort of like take that and like narrow the energy a little bit, which is in some of the time remaining to talk about like where some of like the paths forward go. And I see that there's some conversation about sort of like what's like health of the network as one perspective, and like how it grows and sustains. There's another, which is in this like allow people to experiment, model that Reba was getting at with like, there's some people who want to do private data, some who want to do public data, and some want to retrieval things, some people who want other sorts of stuff. How to enable those folks to experiment. Given that, in the same way that the data cap can be used as like as sort of the dam in the river steering things in one way, if you remove it away entirely, then there's still like a river still flowing in a specific way. It's just a different way than you were before, right? And so you have like you still have the same like incentives, right? If it's like there versus not there, it's just now it's just they now go to a different place. And like, given that's the case, where people feel like the next logical steps go. And JV's got his hand up, so I guess he'll go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually this is both an answer to your question, but maybe also sort of like it dovetails off of the last two sort of things from Will and Reba. Like, I actually think ignoring Phil+ is kind of the correct answer here, because like most of the rest of the world actually does not care. What they care about is like, does Filecoin have paying users? Are people doing stuff on chain? Who are like the high profile integrations? So like Phil+ is an implementation detail along that way. Like, and so I think like if you were to imagine a world with Phil+, which is maybe the current path, if we aren't investing in like get those things to happen, we still lose. If you get rid of Phil+ and you do the 10x multiplier, like it's the same outcome, right? Like I think the only thing that is, I think, worth asking, or like the two questions that are worth asking is like, if you do not have subsidies, like what is the actual cost? Like, is there a market clearing price for Filecoin? Like, have we actually solved the research problems where it is sufficiently like a marginal cost that it could be borne by the client? Like it doesn't cost $30 extra to store like a gigabyte of data or something insane, right? Like if we are sufficiently under that point, then it's not like getting rid of Phil+ is going to stop the market clearing deals from happening, but it maybe opens the aperture for experimentation. I think in the pro Phil+ camp, the next question would be like, okay, how are we currently rate limiting the experimentation? And like, if Phil+ were to stay, like, what are the things that we need to do so that we are not like only focusing energy on like a very specific vector course because of how strong the incentive pull is and like the requirement for SPs to be sustainable. I think even if we got rid of Phil+, like my expectation of what would happen is like you have some amount of experimentation, maybe there's like more volatility in the price. Like it's possible that many more miners just purely convert to like, we're only going to do CC or whatever. I expect those are miners that currently are paying for data cap that is like whatever manufactured, yada, yada. And so like, I actually don't know if that changes that much from that perspective. I do think like anyways, it's just kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off of like, if you aren't getting an external client to give you money, like it will be more expensive for you to run your operation. Like that is, I think so long as the software costs continue to get pushed down, like that is sort of the stasis, right? Because it's either you're fronting it yourself or you're like competing against someone who is getting a client to like hopefully pay them like a little bit of a profit on top. So I don't know if I really want to just like hone in on like, regardless of Phil+ or not Phil+, it's like the three things that really matter: paid deals, on-chain activity, high profile integrations. And we should be focusing on like, what is the setup that gets us those things on the fastest trajectory?
Okay. I guess the one things I would say, or maybe two things. I think I agree with the like, it's the software to some extent. We do need good software, and we should figure out how to be investing in getting software that meets some more user demands. So like, what is the right path to actually have good workable experimentation of software? And that's different from changing.
I'm totally not looking at Danny right.
So that's a separate thing, right? Which is like, you need these sort of end-to-end things that are addressing client needs. I guess, Jonathan, maybe one thing that I do feel somewhat has a grain of truth. That's the like, if we just drop Phil Plus and like let's see what happens with CC, is like the underlying cost that Filecoin SPs are going to be able to have is higher than the underlying cost for a centralized entity like Amazon at any tier that Amazon offers. We don't have the scale, and we have some additional crypto stuff. And even if that's marginal, our underlying cost is higher, right? And so the little margin in between is going to be less than what Amazon has, or one of these centralized cloud providers. And so it's going to be pretty tough to have cost competitive offerings to external entities to bring in money without some network subsidy, right? Like I think that feels like this fairly convincing thing. Like our underlying costs are not going to be lower. We certainly have inefficiencies now. Even as we reduce some of those inefficiencies, I think that's going to be higher. I think there's a second part, which is the costs of things that end up being these like high profile interactions, or especially user facing, or things that bring us more recognition, are going to be even more costly. Especially as you allow something that's got unknown users, or even when you're doing things like saying, hey, let's archive Solana or some other public data set or blockchain, and then people are going to be able to get it. It's like, I don't know that has been audited. It's some public data set. What happens when I get the DMCA takedown? I've got some operational risk. I have to hire the ops person to handle that, and the potential for DDoS. And there's a set of unknown risks that we have to help SPs get through to I don't know, actually understand those costs. So I think there is this like what's incentivizing that and saying that the market solves that. We need to have some sense of what the funding is going to be that is incentivizing those sorts of things that we want. That if we drop the lever that we have today without being pretty confident that there's something that's going to pick up that slack, I'm pretty worried about the outcome.
And I'll let Ruby go, but just as like a thought experiment, I guess like the right math here is like, what is the marginal cost? Because like if we're assuming this is a miner that's choice is to do CC or not CC, the thing that we're saying is like, what is the marginal cost for that miner to like basically take client deals? Which like if you're now able to use like sealing as a service, like maybe there's other like deal aggregator protocols and like teams that are like coming online, but like theoretically, like those teams can be like doing that. So like the right question is actually like, what is that marginal cost of like now taking deals versus over and above CC? And I think it is way more expensive when we're asking a miner to do all of those businesses as like one entity. I'm not so sure I agree that like now that you have more teams that are trying to focus, like Aave or like any of these other folks that are trying to be like on-ramps, like that sounds like a value prop for them to be the front end and like basically be like one shared fractional resource across like a market of SPs. I'm not necessarily sure that that's actually like a transaction that can't clear, you know, because like it is kind of a fixed cost. And like the right question is like, can they get enough scale of like paying customers to like cover all the things? But I think it's like a good point, but I think it's like, I would maybe reframe like how does that equation stack up?
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about numbers. So I don't know if you noticed, but we kind of are a stable coin for the last 2 years and stable around a certain, USD price. This price is not coming out of thin air. It is actually dictated by how the system works when all the friction is factored in. So let's say tomorrow we say like, you know what, anyone can mint any data cap that they want. This will not affect the actual block reward supply for 24 hours because it's not in any way it's not even dependent on power at this point, and it will never like catch up with the baseline, this like weirdness that we have in our emission. The point is that today, right now, we are producing about 108 or let's say 110 Filecoin, 110,000 Filecoin every 24 hours. If everything in the network would have been data capable, then your income from providing consents to the network is about 1.3 Filecoin per terabyte per month. The clearing price for keeping hardware online without the sealing and everything is about $3, $4 per month. What I'm getting at is that the network today, from a platform standpoint, is already at equilibrium. And anything that happens beyond that is value added from the extra services that can be done. So originally in like 2021, it was the speculation of oh my god, this new thing I need in. Today it will be all the stuff that JB is talking about. And this is also why I brought up the numbers that already 30% of the network takes home more than 80% of the block rewards. So by giving away this power, we are not really giving away anything because the power is already lost, because the market has voted with their feet. We were 2 years ago, we were at our peak, we were at about 18 exabytes or something like that. Now we're at 6. And it continues dropping down because it is just not economical. What's economical is the stuff that I just said, that if you have your enhanced staking, then you get your 1.3 just about fill per terabyte per month. And from that, now you can do things. You can, sell additional services and just charge people for the networking and be sitting pretty. You can also bank on, hey, there is this distributed network, actual distributed network, because every node has to process this. There's an actual distributed network that does validate that I physically have your data. This is not anything that anyone else can provide. And what I'm getting at is that we are at equilibrium. We're just somehow not acknowledging it, which is really weird to me, because all the SPs that I talk to have figured it out, and they are planning with this in mind, and they are looking for data cap and all this kind of stuff, because this is how the math works out for them. And again, even at the pretty terrible level of field USDT that we have right now, a Filecoin SP is actually profitable. It still prints money. And anything else on top is a bonus. Wow, silence.
So yeah. So yeah. Well, I mean, so the question they're sort of pushing is where, sort of where next, right? There's probably more there. I think maybe with some time remaining, unless people want to talk more about that, we can chat about what about, we haven't really, I feel like we haven't gotten to have seen these sorts of conversations in a way that people can access them that much in the past, and what you guys think would be helpful to see more of, and what sort of things working, things not working, that we can help to bring more of this to the community, because even as we have to have maybe more progress on what the next step is, as Danny mentioned, the process is largely soft consensus, which means getting a lot of people on board, which means getting a lot of people informed. And so, yeah, hearing more about where that goes next.
Probably not for this discussion, but I think this probably, I mean, I know there's PDP stuff that's in the works. I do think there is actually, Ruva had said this way back at the beginning of so what is the network, or what does the network want to be? And I do think actually this is a deeper, more fundamental question about how do we want tokenomics to work? What are the things that we're actually spending inflation on? I know there's different philosophies, and I will not make any sort of value judgments on them, but I actually think this is an important community discussion, because there are different philosophies and some of them are a little bit more in contention. And I think yeah, we will, like, Phil Plus is one manifestation of this question, but it's also like not even entirely there, because it's like, if we want to evolve the crypto econ and say like, hey, there should be some incentives to like support X, Y, or Z thing, like those have to be forks. And I think even just getting more alignment in the community around like, yeah, like what are we actually like trying to build towards, I think is like a deeper question. Yeah, PvP.
Yeah, then let me jump in here, like very quickly. So why I was pushing actually for this call to happen in this format is exactly to demonstrate that people are actually thinking about this. People who, at least in the community, are perceived to have access to official source of power. Let's put it this way. Not everyone in this call has that. Like I'm not involved with anything PL for the past 2 months, but the very fact that people have not walked away and people are thinking about this and people are discussing this is crucial and is missing in any conversation that I have privately, because everybody's kind of like, the official has cut the leaks and have, given up. And having another conversation about what is the network for in exactly a yes and kind of setup, I think we should have another one like this. Maybe we invite a couple SPs or something like that. I don't know, like I leave this to somebody like Adin or Danny who have better, judgment of how different voices will melt with what we were having here. But yeah, we should continue this conversation, and the sooner the better, because despair is setting in the circles that I frequent, and I'm not being dramatic.
So I think one of the things to note, right, is that like we're gonna swap out our governance system pretty soon. Like one of the reasons why you end up with a lot of conversations, probably mostly in smaller groups, right, is that people have a lot of ideas, but they don't really have a vehicle for changing Phil Plus, except in a kind of soft lobbying, except in the kind of the thing that I think a lot of people have been sort of successfully doing, which is to, try moving the pieces around. But I think there's a genuine sort of push, and has been for a very long time, for like either doing something outside of Phil Plus or changing Phil Plus sort of profoundly, right? But there hasn't been really an outlet for that. Like it's you can imagine a world where everybody agreed on what should happen, but I think it's like we've seen here is that like we've all sort of had a sort of standard pitch about what direction we should go in, but we're not quite sure how to like massage that into like one thing. And it's probably because we don't want one thing, right? We want a lot of different, like let 1,000 Filecoins bloom or whatever. So the question is that I think when the governance system sort of switches over to something where people can get change without soft consensus, I think the first thing is, I've said this for a while, like the first proposed FIP is going to be something to do with Phil Plus, right? So the question is like, in that political environment, can people come together to come up with a FIP that does something, right, which is a bundle of things that everyone can see some reason for doing it, or just rewriting it completely? I think like having that as your destination, having a destination of a FIP or something like that, that changes these variables, right? Because up until this point, we've had things that are constant, that maybe we never thought of as constant, and we have new opportunities and new things where we just want to shake things up a little bit. So that's kind of vaguely the direction that I see this going in. And I think that there's an interesting time scale on that, right? Because if it's going to happen anyway, someone is going to propose something along these lines, and the question is does that get enough? Does that get enough votes, right? And what is the if people don't say something, then it's not going to be part of that conversation. not
again-
quite the bomb, not quite. I need a Reba mic drop thing
Yeah,
to
yeah.
end this with.
Reba,
Reba, you have to say something like,
Reba approves. Yeah, no, actually, I was going to jump in that I agree with what you said, with the caveat that this applies for things that do. This applies to things that do have to do with the consensus. So, for example, the distribution of Fuel Plus. But as I hope we established, at least in this conversation, is that Fuel Plus is almost like a symptom, right? It's not like the core thing. It's the notion of having folks like that are coming, for example, to the SPWG to build in a direction that is not blessed by the official, so it does not satisfy Spark, does not satisfy Fuel Plus criteria and stuff like that, is okay. Because today there is a understanding that there isn't even a point of building it until the powers that be, so to speak, green-lighted. Even though on this call, we know very well that the powers that be are not what they were a few months ago. A number of our employing companies no longer exist. While PL is doing fine, but has shifted his focus. Yet this is not something that percolates to the community at large at all. They still see, they still see Jennifer posting upgrade schedules. They still see, keynotes at the Filecoin Data Summit and so on and so forth. Nothing has changed in terms of what the community sees. And this is why I think it's so important to, yes, talk about like how we're going to do changes in the consensus there, but also talk about the fact that a consensus is not required to build things on the platform that is Filecoin. And this, I think, what's sorely missing today.
I wonder if that couples with some sense of like, if having more certainty around consensus also helps you do things that are non-consensus, because you understand what it would take for the rug to get, pulled from underneath you if you did something that was off the beaten path. But
yes, you need to know what the platform is to build on it. Yes.
Yeah. All right, and with that, want to thank all of you for your time, and thank you for having me. And until next time.
Thanks,
Those of
everyone.
you who are going to be
Thank you.
in Brussels at the events there, come say hi.
Let's consider having another one of these, maybe in person or recorded in that time frame as well.
Sounds good. All right, recording stop.